Hello and welcome to Savills Industry Talk for the Royal Highland Show. I am Molly Bedell. I'm part of the Savills Rural Research team. I specialise in natural capital and net zero, and I am the research lead for Scotland. And today I'm delighted to be joined by my very able colleagues from the natural capital team in Scotland. We've got William Hawes and Charlie Davis. Today, we are going to have a conversation on natural capital and what it means for land managers and farmers in Scotland. So I'm going to start by briefly going over what we actually mean by natural capital. Natural capital is an emerging trend having an impact on how we view and, importantly, how we value rural land. And it brings with it a plethora of opportunities for land managers. It's most commonly understood as the world's stock of natural resources. So we're talking about water, rock and air. Essentially, it is everything that makes up natural ecosystems. In terms of semantics, we tend to talk about stocks of natural capital, your natural assets, which deliver flows of ecosystem services, which in turn hold a value to society. So some examples of those ecosystem services would include the carbon sequestration of trees and soil, the filtering of water, the health benefits of public access to green space, the wildlife conservation of habitats with high levels of biodiversity, and finally, the flood prevention provided by floodplains and peatland, but that's by no means an exhaustive list. And these natural assets and their ecosystem services have not typically been recorded on balance sheets at either national or business level, which has led to them being undervalued in financial decision making. However, as society and business increasingly realise the value of ecosystem services in combating climate change, restoring nature, reducing pollution and supporting societal well-being, there are income opportunities and incentives for land managers who can provide these services. So that's the 101 on what natural capital actually is. In terms of what's driving this new agenda, there are three key policy areas. The key driver in Scotland is our net zero emissions by 2045 target, which is one of the most ambitious climate targets globally. It's a massive policy lever for natural capital investment, both in decarbonising processes, but also in increasing demand for natural carbon sequestration. With COP 2016 approaching in November and being hosted in Glasgow, Scotland are clearly looking to drive the agenda in terms of a green recovery here. The other policy drivers in Scotland is obviously Scotland's future agricultural policy and, of course, the future environmental policy. We are currently in a period of simplicity and stability until 2024, so we don't quite know what that's going to look like, and there are questions over what will eventually emerge. So that was a very high-level overview from me, but William, I wanted to ask you, why are we suddenly talking about natural capital?
Thanks, Molly. Given everything you've said, why wouldn't we be? I think you've given some real compelling background which sets out the importance of this subject to everyone in society, business, the economy, particularly why is it an issue we're wrestling with so much in the rural sector. I think it's the land-based businesses really recognising that they play such a key and central role to contributing to the solution, both climate change and the loss of biodiversity. I think that not only can we be part of the solution, climate risk is a huge challenge for our businesses. And I think we need to be slightly more corporate about it and put this on our rural businesses risk register, just like a property fund or a bank might do too. Because if we don't solve the climate crisis, then it's going to seriously undermine food production, rural communities, land near coastal communities in Scotland. So I think it's absolutely central to everything we're doing, Molly. But beyond that, we know that there's going to be some change in policy. You've described a bit of it, and we might touch on some later, which is going to change the source of income for these rural businesses. We're going to be looking for new diversified income streams, and we're going to be looking for the public and the private sector to value some of the ecosystem service, some of the nature-based solutions that we can provide through rural businesses, particularly farms.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think it's the combination of both having the macro level of changes and then the micro actually policy is changing post-Brexit. What are we looking towards? They're both sort of creating a perfect storm of natural capital. So that's sort of high level theory. I suppose, Charlie, what does this actually mean on the ground for farmers?
Well, Molly, many farm businesses already have policies which are focused on caring for or enhancing the environment. But I think this heightening awareness of the climate crisis and the need for sustainably produced food has increased the scrutiny of the impact of agriculture on the environment. And as William says, farmland very often represents a carbon emitter within a business, while having a huge potential as a carbon sink. As the need to understand and manage and report the environmental impacts of farm businesses increases, I think farmers should be considering getting to grips with their net carbon balance as a business, and the extent of their current emissions, and therefore that liability, that risk that William was talking about. And you can do this through a comprehensive carbon audit, and that's a good way of getting to grips with where emissions are emanating from, and what methods could potentially be employed to reduce those emissions, and start to make decisions based on data about what a proportionate and economically justifiable route would be to reduce emissions and begin to use the inherent potential of land as a carbon sink to its full potential. I think in practice, this usually takes the form of increasing perennial biomass, such as trees and hedgerows, and looking at where maybe land could be used better, maybe underperforming land could be used better for environmental purposes on farm, and also crucially to understand soil organic matter levels in the soil, and actually just begin to understand the soil a little bit better.
So, Molly, if I could, I think Charlie's, that you've outlined perfectly where we are, and just to distill it down, really, I think because we do get lost in new language and terminology. But what Charlie is saying, I think, Charlie, is really businesses, rural businesses, have to focus on their own sustainability first. This is what this, I hesitate to say new world, because I think the agricultural sector has been sustainable for a long time in many different forms. But in terms of the environment, we are now looking to be more sustainable. So the business has to be sustainable first. And if there's to be any hope of any income from ecosystem services, nature-based solutions in the future, you have to have your own house in order first to make sure that you're not negatively impacting the environment, where you could do something differently which would have less of an impact. Only then, when you've hit this baseline, and Charlie talked about data, it's crucial, you can start to think about whether or not there are services you're providing to wider society that have a value to other business or corporations, whatever it might be.
Absolutely. Sort of having all your ducks in order, or as I heard someone say, you can't offer your green services to someone if you're in the red, you have to be in the green as well. So it's that idea. Exactly. Yeah. And Charlie, in terms of, you mentioned data, you mentioned soil carbon. So have we got farmers already out there measuring soil carbon? Is that being done?
Oh, absolutely. Increasingly, measuring soil organic matter or soil carbon is becoming standard practice for farmers who are beginning to really see the soil that they grow their crops in and graze as the foundation of their farm business. Managing soil carbon is critical to reducing carbon emissions from soil, as well as being a really good key indicator for all over soil health. And farmers we speak to are increasingly seeing the connection between soil emissions and the management practices that they undertake, and taking regular measurements is an empowering way to manage that soil carbon and potentially communicate what they're doing for their environmental credentials to other people, and protect that fundamental resource that's under our feet. Currently, there's no UK-based framework for accreditation of soil carbon in the same way that we have for woodland and peatland. But whether or not there's a kind of tradable market for soil carbon, that doesn't seem to be the key motivator for good soil management. Instead, there seems to be growing recognition of the other benefits of improved soil health, reducing emissions, reducing that risk that we were talking about to the rural business, and other benefits like mitigation of hydrology, improving hydrology across a landscape, soil structure, better nutrient transfer to crops. Many farmers are seeing the benefit of good soil management is having for their business already. So yeah, it's increasingly part of our conversations, and it increasingly seems to be the way that people are thinking. And I think William's right to point out that this stuff isn't new. You know, this isn't some new science. This is actually stuff that we've known for a long time. But it's just perhaps refocusing are and being able to employ better measurement science as well, like cheaper ways of measuring soil carbon, are really facilitating a real illumination of cause and effect of management to soil carbon. And I think that's really, really empowering, really positive.
So, Charlie, we are often looking for incentives to do things differently. You know, we've talked a lot about sustainability, and now specifically on soil carbon. You've just described well, I think, a lot of what the listeners will know about the benefits of increasing soil organic matter. But still, it feels to me, Molly, that there's got to be some sort of policy around that. We know it, lots of businesses do it, lots of businesses will be performing well, but we're looking for some sort of framework to work within. It may not necessarily be an incentive. We haven't got an accreditation system for soil carbon. We're waiting on new agricultural policy in Scotland, Molly. And from a rural research perspective, you and your team do a lot of background work into trying to predict the direction of travel. I wonder if you could give us a bit on that and whether we can draw any comparisons in the English and Welsh agricultural policies which have already emerged.
Yeah, absolutely, William. So I think, yeah, as we say, there's no accreditation in the UK yet for soil carbon. But if we're looking at public policy, so we know that Scotland's ag policy is taking a little bit more time to develop, but hopefully post-election we'll start to see some announcements trickle in. I think if we look back to the previous government, obviously Mr. Ewing put together his sector-led farming groups, and that was all about advising on how farming and Scotland's ambitious net zero target can work together. So in other words, how food production and reaching net zero can be symbiotic. And I think soil carbon is, well, it was highlighted and it obviously is crucial in enabling this. So it will definitely play a part. I'm absolutely certain of that. If we look directly over to England's policy, I'm going to talk about England because it's a little bit more developed at the moment. We have got details. So the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is the sort of first component of the environmental land management scheme in England. There are payments out there for soil management plans, and it's incremental. So if you're just as a farmer and you want to input a little bit into your soil management, you'll get some payment, but if you go full whack, you'll get even more payments. So there are definitely incentives starting to trickle through, and really what it's doing is it's just rewarding farmers for good practice, as we've said. So it's sort of a no-brainer, and I think we'll definitely see it in policy. So yeah, we are waiting on this domestic policy, but I suppose, William, away from the domestic policy side of things and the policy incentives, what about the private marketplace for natural capital? Are we starting to see those markets emerge?
We are starting to, Molly, definitely. Most people who are listening to this will be familiar with the voluntary carbon market now, I imagine. Charlie touched on the woodland and peatland carbon codes, which accredit and validate woodland and peatland carbon respectively, which developers of schemes can trade. And they trade those with emitters who can use those validated carbon credits to offset their own emissions in formal reporting, which is helpful. I mean, and it's doing what natural capital is designed to do, which is encouraging good behaviour in terms of environmental management, a more holistic approach to land management. It's made restoring some peatlands viable where they weren't before. It's made creating some new woodlands and encouraging natural regeneration viable where it wasn't before. We call that really still an emerging market, and it is an emerging market, particularly in terms of value, and there's lots of commentary around what will happen to value. The majority say that it's going to appreciate, and appreciate quite quickly if you look at how society should value carbon in order to reach our net zero targets. Others will say we should be more tempered because we haven't yet seen any policy around carbon taxes, either at the point of production or consumption, and we don't know what that will do. So that is there. So as I say, we call it emerging, but actually compared to where we are with the rest of our ecosystem services markets, it's not. It's actually relatively well established in that it's there and it's got framework. We do expect other markets to emerge. Of course we do. We look at water and quality. Molly, you touched on flood attenuation. That's achieved. Some of those co-benefits of the work that's already been going on in peatland restoration and woodland creation. And as Charlie said, in improving soil organic matter, that will come too. So there are other areas where we think ecosystem services markets will emerge. But I think what we are saying, Molly, is again, going back to basics, is we need holistic, sustainable land management approaches. I would be wary of anyone a land manager who suggested that you should chase a particular ecosystem services market. These things and management policies are so site specific. They have to fit in with any other things that the business is doing economically and not undermine the viability of those other operations. And it needs to make sense on whatever scale that business is in. You couldn't suddenly create a whole farm, turn a whole farm to woodland, or it might not be viable to restore all the peatland in a particular farm if you can't keep it in that good restored condition. The same will come when it comes to water. And we haven't even touched on biodiversity yet, which is the second pillar of our major crisis, loss of biodiversity, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. So we know, again, if we look to England, and your team, Molly, has kept us really well abreast of this in Scotland, you have got some policy emerging, biodiversity net gain. So through planning policy, again, this is Scottish based, but for the benefit of our listeners, I think it's important. We'll just set the background, which is that developers need to offset the loss of biodiversity from their development, and that could either be on-site or off-site if it's not possible. So land managers are creating habitat banks now where developers can enter into arrangements with them to replace and provide an enhancement to the biodiversity which is lost in that development. So that's created this market biodiversity. It feels to me as if it's got to be much bigger than just offsets from development. We've got to do a lot more to encourage enhancement of biodiversity. But one of the problems is that we in Scotland don't have that policy yet, and therefore we don't have a metric for measurement.
Yeah, we don't have that in Scotland, as you say. Charlie, you're our expert on biodiversity. Can you measure biodiversity in Scotland without a standard method, and what do you suggest that people do?
Well, that's a big question. Can you measure biodiversity at all? That's a huge question that I think ecologists would throw their hands up and say, you know, actually this is a really, really difficult thing that we're trying to do. So you're absolutely right. Biodiversity, the second pillar of the climate crisis, breakdown of ecosystems, seems to have been largely left behind from our discussions of the environment in Scotland so far. And part of that, I suspect, is because it's much more complicated to measure than carbon. And the effects and kind of management to outcome is much less linear and much harder to restore those ecosystems. And there's a lot of disagreement even within academia about how one would go about doing that. In England and Wales, DEFRA, as you say, have developed a metric for biodiversity gain that's being used within the planning system there. And that's based on the assumed link between habitat availability and habitat condition and biodiversity. In Scotland, not yet confirmed how biodiversity will be measured or where value will be found in enhancing it, or where that will be derived from. But a lot of the measures that go along with the management of carbon, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions on farm, good, holistic, sustainable management practices, like increasing perennial biomass, like restoring those hedgerows that are looking a bit ropey, like improving soil health, will inevitably benefit habitat and hopefully biodiversity. It potentially will be slow burn, but I think anything that we can be doing, any opportunities that we can be identifying to do every little bit that we can to increase structural diversity of habitat, the availability of habitat on farm within our businesses, then we should be doing that. I think really the answer is that we need to watch this space for exactly how the Scottish Government are planning to measure biodiversity, but it's a good thing to be aware of, and where possible kind of try and build in biodiversity as a kind of co-benefit of other sustainability measures that we might be looking at as part of our business strategy.
Absolutely. I think it's avoiding siloed thinking, isn't it, and making sure we're staying broad. So I'm going to wrap up by asking both of you, Charlie and William, what your key takeaway is for land managers and farmers who want to start thinking more seriously about natural capital and engaging with the concept. So I'm going to go to William first. William, what's your key takeaway?
I think, Molly, good question. I would just say I think that many land-based, they are thinking seriously already, I'm sure, about natural capital. And this key takeaway, therefore, for me, is just go back to basics. We're thinking about how to be more sustainable as an operation. It's a bit boring, but I will keep banging that drum. How can we be more sustainable? How can we produce what we're producing more sustainably, and therefore keep it simple, keep it sustainable, and keep it simple? If it's something that land managers involved in the industry or farmers for a number of years don't understand readily, it feels to me to be wrong. This isn't about a new complex world where everything is going to be beyond the ability and reach of land managers that have been in the industry for a long time. It isn't about that. It's just about a refocus on being sustainable. And as we deliver those things that society need, society and business will place a value on them, I'm sure, and we'll be able to generate some income streams as we go along.
Brilliant, thank you. And Charlie, what's your key takeaway?
Well, reiterating what William said, but really coming in from a practical stance, I think now is the time to start measuring, start getting to grips with where we are. That piece about getting your ducks in a row. You can't come up with a strategy for engaging with natural capital without knowing where you stand now as a business in terms of your environmental status. So now is the time to start asking those questions, collecting that data, and then from there you can draw out what outcomes and strategies are going to be relevant to you, because every single business is going to be different in terms of what natural resources they have, what their current status is, and the other resources and other priorities that are part of their strategy. But data measuring, really, really important. So that would be my key takeaway.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you very much, William and Charlie. And thank you to everyone who has watched this. Hopefully you feel up to speed on natural capital and what we're doing from Savills. Many thanks.